Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us at our WXN virtual book club event. I am pleased to be able to introduce this month's author, Eternity Martis. Eternity is a journalist, author, and adjunct professor at UBC, and she is our WXN Top 100 Award winner in the RBC Future Launch Future Leaders Award category. She is an award-winning journalist and editor whose work, namely on race and gender, has been featured in Vice, Huffington Post, CBC, Hazlitt, Maclean's Chatelaine, The Walrus, and many more. She is the author of the best-selling memoir, They Said It Would Be Fun, about her experience being a Black woman on a predominantly white university campus. She helped influence Canadian media style guides to capitalize Black and Indigenous, and is the course developer and instructor of the Reporting on Race, Black Communities in the Media course at Ryerson University, the first of its kind in Canada. She is currently the journalist in residence and an adjunct professor at UBC. We'd like to thank Eternity for her time that she's taken with us, and we look forward to your session.
Thank you, Virginia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Eternity, and very excited to be the May book club pick. May is also my birth month, so I love all things that go down in May. And today, I just want to give you a rundown of the format that I will be conducting this book club in. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about parts of the book, and then I'll do a little bit of a reading from the sections and the subjects that I'm discussing, and then I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. So please submit your questions. You can do so through the chat function, and if you like, you're more than welcome to chat while I'm discussing. So one of the reasons I think that is important to this book is that it's a memoir, and I really struggled with trying to figure out how to write this book, and it took many shapes. So it was first a novel, it was a play, it was a blog, it was everything that wasn't real, and there were a lot of reasons for that, namely being that at the time, I hadn't seen any books like my book. I didn't really know of the things that I'd experienced. I was experiencing them, but I hadn't seen a lot of literature or memoirs about it. And also to note about this time, it was about 2010 when I was at Western, and I started writing a little bit after that. But from 2010 to 2014, nobody was really talking about race. There was no discussion about like a public discussion about race, about gender-based violence, to take aside whether you were an author or a brand or an athlete or an actor was kind of seen as like, no, like you're not supposed to do that, right? You don't take sides. And so nobody was really talking about this stuff except in my own circles. It was a whisper network of sorts where you would tell people that you experience racism or sexism or sexual violence, but you never spoke about it publicly. And so just about at the tail end of my time at Western in 2014, when I graduated, 2 months after I graduated, Mike Brown was shot and killed, and Black Lives Matter had become a global movement, and race issues had kind of come up again in ways we hadn't really seen since the 90s, especially with the Rodney King beating. And during this time at Western, also the beginning of Black Lives Matter was with the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman, in 2013. But that still wasn't a good enough push. And so when I talked about what I was experiencing at Western, which was racism, sexism, misogynoir, which is the combination of racism and sexism the Black women experience, nobody believed me. At home, my family, my friends, they didn't believe me. They thought I was exaggerating. And they thought that I was kind of a little bit too sensitive, that I saw everything as being an issue of race. And so as the years went on and I started to notice that some of my friends that I was meeting, they were having the same experiences, not just of experiencing racism, but of feeling anxious, feeling depressed, feeling lonely, dropping out of school, transferring schools, just kind of leaving the institution of post-secondary education entirely. I realized that there was something here. So regardless of whether anyone was talking about it, regardless if they believed us or not, I thought we were exaggerating, we knew that this was happening. And so in writing the book, it was important for me to write this story about myself. But as I had graduated in 2014, when you look at 2015, 2016, today, there's been a real shift in our culture and a real polarizing culture of, of those who are on the left and those who are on the right. And so during this time I was writing the book, there were a lot of conversations about free speech and hate speech. There was the emergence of the alt-right, which ended up being on university spaces. There was the Donald Trump era. So a lot has changed. And so it was important to me to write a book that was true. And it was about me, but it was also about the other people who I knew who had this experience, and also about the many, many others who have lived this. And one of the best things about my book coming out, and I guess, the biggest blessing to me, is that I have spoken to so many people around the world who have gone to university and college, generations of Western students, no matter when they were, students, people who were at Western and other universities before I was born, who had the exact same experience. So there's a real intergenerational trauma aspect of going to university when you're a woman or you're a person of color, and I wanted to capture that. So one of the things that I want to talk about first, one of the themes of the book, is identity and trying to fit in. And if you've read the book, you know that I really just try to fit in everywhere I can, and it's hard for me because I kind of live at all these weird intersections. My grandfather and my mother and I, we live in the same house. My grandfather was middle class, my mom was working class. My mom's side of the family are from Karachi, Pakistan. My dad is Jamaican, but I grew up with brown people, so I look like this in a completely brown family. It was really confusing for me. Because of my grandfather's influence, I liked things that I learned were called middle class values: going to the theater, going to the ROM in Toronto, going to the art museum. And so I was never Black enough. And on top of that, I loved rock music, I loved emo music, I loved alternative types of music and indie rock. And I dressed that way, and so nobody wanted to be associated with me. And it was really hard for me because while I was in high school, and I went to a high school that was predominantly Black and Asian students, everybody knew kind of where they fit. But because I didn't know, and because at home, nobody had ever referred to me as Black, nobody had ever referred to me as mixed, I was just there. And to them, to my family, I was Pakistani. I didn't know how to communicate on either side. And so I really struggled growing up with what I was, especially as I got a bit older and I started to notice I'd go out with my mom, and the server would ask for if we wanted separate checks. Or my mom, who's very, very chatty, she chats with everybody. She would talk to people, and I'd be standing there and she'd say, yeah, me and my daughter are doing this. And they'd look over my head and say, well, where's your daughter? And I'd be standing right there. So that was starting to happen. And I didn't know how to kind of articulate that to my family, despite me looking like this, despite there being certain instances of dealing with racism within the family, within my friend groups. Nobody brought up that I was Black. And so to go to London, I had chosen to go to London with my best friend, Taz, because one, I wanted to kind of figure out who I was outside of the space of high school. Not all of us were the popular kids. I was super lonerish and angsty, and I wanted to kind of form a new identity that I knew that I could outside of Toronto, but also because I wanted to have a good time. And I was very sheltered, and my roommate Taz, my best friend Taz, she was very sheltered too, and she came from a very religious family. And so we just wanted this new experience, and Maclean's magazine said it was a party school, like the top party school in Canada. And growing up, I always wanted freedom, and I had a real love and adoration of the concept of freedom and what it meant. And so I'd watch movies about like sororities and fraternities, and I thought, okay, I can do that. London Western is as close as it gets to these beautiful blonde actors. I'm gonna go do that. And so the first thing that came up when I got to London almost immediately was that identity of student life and being this carefree young student was not what I had formed. There was already a perception of me, and it was that I was Black and that I was a woman, and I was a Black woman. And a lot of what I experienced in my first year on campus in residence was were these comments about being Black. Oh, we have a Black girl on our floor. There was a total of about 4 of us in a dorm of 500 plus. So, oh, my friend has like dated a Black girl, or Black girls are good in bed. And so it wasn't just being Black, it was also this kind of label of sexuality placed on me. All these things coming at me when I don't even know who I am yet. And one of the ways that really manifested for me and solidified my identity was in the nightlife scene. So London has a really big nightlife scene, party scene. There's not much else to do in London when you're young. And one of the ways that I found out what it meant to be a Black woman was in bars and in clubs. And so my roommate Taz, my best friend, she was a dark-skinned woman, but she wasn't Black, she was South Asian. And there was such a stark difference in how we were treated when we were out in public together. And so this section of the book is about what it means to navigate spaces, white spaces, nightlife spaces, charged spaces as a Black woman versus as a brown woman. And I start with this section about an incident that happens where these 2 white men are harassing my friend Taz, and I ask them to stop, and they threaten to beat me up. They threaten me with violence. And I parallel this experience with something that happened in the area 10 years ago with a Black woman. I don't know her name. Her name wasn't mentioned in the story. It was considered a hate crime, so they didn't name her for some reason. But just seeing parallels even 10 years later in London in the same spot. All right. 10 years separated these incidents. 10 minutes was the distance between where and when they happened. And in their eerie similarities, it was as if nothing had changed at all. Tess and I never spoke about what happened that night. During the confrontation, she was laughing at its absurdity, but that didn't ease my feelings about being an unwanted visitor. We were used to men's attempts to hit on us by bringing up race, that they had never danced with a Black or brown woman, that their friend once dated a Black woman or a brown woman like us, and they wanted to know what it was like. However, we experienced these sexually racist pickup lines in different ways. Around town, brown women and white men were one of the more common interracial pairings we had seen. To men, Taz was still exotic, but they were used to seeing women like her. They saw her as passive, smart, and respectable enough. For me, the conversations veered directly into stereotypes, addressing me as boo, ma, ebony, or chocolate. The verbs were endless. I've never danced with, spoken to, touched, seen, talked to, dated, kissed a Black girl. If I rejected in advance, I was a Black bitch. If we talked about my multiracial background, they'd focus on me being Jamaican and Black enough with a wink. They called me Beyonce, Solange, Nicki Minaj. Sometimes men would stand in front of me, staring at me with a smirk as they hit on me, their friends laughing behind them. Sometimes they said nothing, only leered. Many of the men Taz met wanted to get to know her, but most of them wanted to know what I was like in bed. White guys who approached her at the bar would gently pull her aside to talk or take her on dates during the day. Meanwhile, men were either approaching me to make a racist remark and leave, or ask if it was true that once you go Black, you never go back. As men put their hands on the small of Taz's back, they were shoving me out of the way. Men treated me with a mix of hypersexuality and animalistic aggression, pushing me around like I was less than a woman, less than human. They were quick to anger around me, quick to threaten me with physical harm just for opening my mouth. One of these men was a big dude, a tall and burly Rick Ross lookalike who was twice our age. His face, dark and glistening with sweat, didn't crack a smile as he towered over Taz, who just minutes ago was standing alone as I went to get us drinks. Yo, Indian girl, you're so sweet. Let me talk to you, he said as he swiped at her like a bear blindly trying to catch a fish in a pond. Can you leave her alone? You're making her uncomfortable, I said. He swatted me out of the way. I'm trying to talk to your friend, he said in his deep voice. I put myself in front of her. She clearly doesn't want to talk to you. He turned around to face me, several inches taller, so close I could smell the saltiness of his sweat. Mind your business. It's my business if you're harassing my friend. I led Taz away from the crowd, but he grabbed her other arm, yanking her back. Taz was silent, her eyes wide and fearful in the middle of this tug of war. Eventually, we broke free. We were both shaken up and decided to go home. As we crossed the street, a black SUV screeched, sharply turning onto the road, speeding towards me at nearly 60 kilometers an hour. Its lights blinded me as the driver floored it. Taz pulled me out of the way, but the SUV swerved towards me again, roaring as it accelerated, headlights blinding me. It mimicked my pattern as I moved forward and stepped backwards. When I got close enough that I could see past its beams, I saw him behind the wheel, the guy from the bar. I had poked the fucking bear. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. I stood in the road, drunk with liquid bravado, as he sped closer, the people around me gasping and squealing. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. The car was revving. It was charging towards me. Then it stopped, barely a millimeter from my shin. He rolled down his window, contorting his fat fingers into a gun shape and pointed it at me, all while looking me dead in the eyes. "Nigga mercy," he yelled, before rolling up the window and swerving around me and driving off. This man, who I'm guessing was trying to tell me that he had done me the honor of saving my life instead of running me over because we were both Black, was set on making me pay for not allowing him to sexually harass my friend. After that night, we'd still see him around Jack's, but he never spoke to Taz again. Instead, he'd bump into me on purpose, spilling my drink. Ignoring him seemed to annoy him more. He lurked in the corner, in my direct line of sight, glaring at me with hatred. I was the woman who had refused to give in to his entitlement, and that had enraged him. One thing was clear about nights out with Taz. I was the punching bag for men. Perhaps it was our physical makeup. Taz, with her small, straight nose, long jet black hair, thin, tiny lips, and flushed pink cheeks, combined with her rich, dark skin and long legs, was a brown Barbie doll. I had a wide nose and full lips, thick thighs, and a head full of big curls. For every great night at Jack's, I spent another up against the wall with a drink in my hand, feeling uncomfortable about my appearance and my place here. I was starting to understand that these weren't just coincidences. This was my reality. This was how misogynoir, the cocktail of racism and sexism that Black women experience, functioned. And this was how people valued my life and my humanity, if at all. I was angry at myself for not being able to forget about these interactions and just enjoy the night like Taz. And I felt scared, especially a few hours in, when inebriation made people vulgar, when the threat of violence or humiliation was too much to gamble on, and I'd resigned myself to the few chairs at the back of the bar, wishing I was home in the comfort of my bed while Taz danced. Taz didn't understand my new reluctance about going out, and it was hard for me to explain that I felt both rejected and objectified, a target of the most sexualized comments and the most abusive. How could I be comfortable in a space where my presence not only made men want to sexualize me, but hurt me too? So a lot of what I learned very, very early on in my time in London was that it was a weird thing, right? You're visible, you're hyper visible, and you're totally invisible as a Black woman, but you're also very sexualized and not sexualized at all. There's this really great meme or meme thing on Instagram that says that people praise features of Black women as long as they're not on Black women. And I found that to be very true. There seemed to be this big culture of sexualizing Black women and liking, Black things, but not when they were on Black women. And so it was really hard, and it actually ended up driving a big wedge between my friendship with Taz, because she just didn't understand it, and a lot of people really didn't. And it wasn't until later in my time at Western in my third and fourth year where I met somebody, a Black woman, who also was having the same experience with her best friend. And she would say, she doesn't get it. She thinks I'm being a bore. She thinks I'm being a nag that I don't want to go out. But it actually is really traumatic to go out and feel unwanted in these spaces. And so sexualization became a really big part of just being a young woman while I was there. But also it made it really hard to date. And so the sexualization of Black women, it's the stereotype of the sexualized Black women has been around for a very long time. And it really emerged around the time of slavery. So the term Jezebel emerged to kind of put this contrast in between white women and Black women. So where white women were seen as kind of godly or closer to God and pure and womanly, Black women were seen as animalistic and always wanting sex. And so that became a way for slave masters to actually sexually assault and rape Black women without fear of being charged without fear of persecution. And that actually continued into the Jim Crow era. So you could actually rape Black women and not serve any time or even be charged or go to court or go to prison, because Black women were always seen as hypersexual, always wanting sex and tempting men. And so therefore you could not be charged with sexually assaulting a Black woman. And so this idea has persisted in different forms. And some of those forms are in the terms of hoochie mama, freak. The names have changed. I'm going to talk about that in the next part that the next reading that I do. But one thing for sure is that it makes it very hard to date, especially when you're young and especially when everyone around you is dating. And for my generation, we kind of grew up in hookup culture. So we came off the tail end of Carrie Bradshaw and Sex and the Cities, having sex like men, and came into this kind of culture as we grew up and turned into adults of Tinder and online dating apps and hookup apps, and another kind of renewed sense of sexual liberation. But none of that ever included Black women, very similar to the ways in which the second wave of feminism really didn't include Black women in its sexual liberation. And so I think around this time, it was also the nasty women comments were coming out. I think that was actually a little bit later, but Black women always said these terms like nasty women, having sex like men, slut walk, all of these things were never meant for Black women. We can't do that when there's a legacy of stereotypes. And so one of the things in my book that I talk about, for those of you who've read it, there's a chapter about a guy that I dated named Anthony. And this chapter was really important for me. There was a couple of lessons that I learned in my time in London, hard lessons. This was one of the hard lessons. I think this was one of the biggest lessons that kind of changed everything for me. And this was the lesson that actually sparked my writing career, my journalism career, because I wrote my first piece for the Huffington Post about this experience. But Anthony was a guy that I dated in my second year. And by then, the stuff that I read to you was already happening. And I was feeling really disillusioned with just men in general, mostly non-Black men, but men in general making these comments about me. And it was really hard to have an interaction, let alone a romantic interaction, but just every interaction I was having, whether it was at the grocery store, whether I was tying my shoes, people in London are very friendly, but it would always come back to race. And so I was really tired of having these conversations about race. You must not be used to the weather here back in the islands, your English is so good, all of the stuff, I was sick of it. And one night I met Anthony during homecoming. And homecoming, for those who went to Western here, know that homecoming is a big deal. And that's how we met. And one of the reasons I was drawn to him was because though he was white, and I was very disillusioned with white men at the time, he never brought up race. And it was refreshing to me that somebody would not bring up my race. Like I think about 9 times out of 10, maybe 10 out of 10, it was always happening. And so we ended up having a very tumultuous relationship. He had a girlfriend that he had said that he was done with. He was a bit older than me, very worldly in my eyes. So I thought it was over. And it ended up playing both of us. But I remember a comment that he made a couple of months down the road, where it was the first time he brought up race, and he said, "I'm really into Black girls, but my family would never let me marry one." And somehow it was the second time I had heard that comment that week. And I was thinking, it made me think, not enough to break up with him at the time, but it made me think of the ways in which Black women are objectified and used in all these different ways, but they're never seen as marriage material. They're not seen as quality women. And so the part that I want to read for you is from this chapter, just about the ways that Black women are seen in mainstream media, and how this really hinders our potential to find love and find a serious relationship. So there we go. Goodness, I have lots of Post-its here. All right. For women of color, so this is talking about sex and about just owning sexuality. For women of color, this relationship is complicated by deeply entrenched stereotypes about our sexuality. For centuries, Black women have been called Jezebels, freaks, and Hottentots. We've been labeled primitive, always ready for sex, and always willing to give it. White women have long been expected to adhere and aspire to the cult of domesticity, the ultimate true womanhood, piety, submission, and purity, whereas Black women are considered inherently and irredeemably incapable of possessing these qualities. Instead, Black women face what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins calls controlling images, stereotypes and tropes that contribute to the sexual objectification that seeks to keep us oppressed. In her 1990 Holy Grail Black feminist thought, Collins says these controlling images are always changing and adapting, each becoming a new starting point for a cultural moment that creates new forms of oppression and commercialization. In other words, the names may change as we evolve, now ratchet, thoughts, bad bitches, but they are still rooted in the same oppressive, damaging narratives about Black women's sexuality. As casual sex and hookup culture becomes more prevalent and the images associated with Black women change in name but continue to be reinforced, it becomes harder for Black women to reclaim their sexuality. Women are demonized for wanting sex. For a Black woman who is already dealing with stereotypes about her animalistic, insatiable sexuality, it is almost impossible for her to say she likes sex without facing judgment and slut shaming. These damaging images have become normalized in our culture and are commonplace. Is it true that Black women are good in bed? I've never had sex with a Black woman. Can you be my first? Once you go Black, you never go back. It can make it hard to find and have a respectful sexual relationship, or any relationship at all, that isn't tainted by the idea of Black women's uncontrollable sexuality and how someone else can benefit. To be a Black woman today means to live in constant hyper-awareness of your body. There are voyeuristic eyes on us at all times, objectifying us into parts. When we date non-Black people, we know that we, not our partners, are sexualized. We know the sexual connotations of the word interracial. We battle with the myth that our bodies are dirty, raunchy, deviant, animalistic, and ungodly. I used to see girls walk home barefoot on London's main road at 8 a.m., holding their vodka-covered stilettos in one hand and using the other to keep their dress from riding up. Guys wandered the streets with disheveled hair and undone dress shirts and no clue where they are. Walks of shamers were also as common as morning joggers. Students who are old enough in the public psyche to be sexually active, yet young enough to be messy, hedonistic wrongdoers, get a pass to publicly express sexuality for the 4 years that they attend university. And this has afforded young women more freedom to take charge of their sex lives. Running back home at dawn with a ripped shirt or a broken stiletto heel is a time-restricted, socially accepted norm for white students. To do the walk of shame as a Black woman is to confront stereotypes about our sexuality head-on, using the same tools and words that oppress us. It's reclaiming the right to celebrate our sexuality in public. It's releasing ourselves from the bonds that have kept us shackled and oppressed in our communities, in our society, and within ourselves. In recent years, young women have used the power of collective walking to take back their right to have consensual sex and celebrate it. Take Back the Night, which started in the 1970s, has grown into an international event on a mission to end sexual and partner violence. Slut Walk began in 2011 after a Toronto police officer told a female student at a safety forum at York University that they shouldn't dress like sluts if they wanted to avoid sexual assault. It is now a global movement in over 200 cities and over 40 countries. For years, Black feminists in the US have argued that Slut Walk excludes Black women. Amber Rose started her own Slut Walk several years ago as a response to slut shaming from both tabloids and her exes Wiz Khalifa and Kanye West. Rose's movement has made space for Black women to condemn sexual injustice and victim blaming, while also promoting sex positivity and highlighting the unique challenges that we face. Sexual liberation is different for us. From the late 90s, white women could look up to their Sex and the City idols, who iconically scandalized television with the idea that women could have sex like men. And the next generation of white girls followed in the footsteps of characters from its successors, girls. For young women of color, however, it's more complicated. Who do Black girls have to look up to on screen? Where are our brunch table conversations about vibrators and orgasms and sex and love? Few shows and films have given us accurate contemporary representations of Black womanhood that are unapologetically sexual. In recent years, we've been graced with Olivia Pope, Annalise Keating, Nola Darling, and the Ladies of Girls strips. But other portrayals are still stigmatizing, and a few films and TV shows like this have been made since I was at university. Even reality TV shows like Basketball Wives, The Real Housewives of Atlanta, and Love and Hip Hop craft images of oversexed Black women who are gold diggers, freaks, or baby mamas, unable to have healthy and faithful relationships or friendships. Movies continue to portray Black women as sexually deviant and undeserving of love. And if we do attempt to explore sexuality, we are punished by losing everything. So I'll stop there, but I get into why Tyler Perry is problematic and how he constantly reproduces the stereotype of Black women not being lovable. And so a lot of what happens in movies and in films and wanting to express ourselves is really hard when you're a young person in this environment where you're told that you can express yourself sexually. And so even though there's a sexualization part, there's also the dehumanization part. And that plays a huge role in violence against women. And talking about gender-based violence is a huge part of my book. Hookup culture has also coincided with rape, like a renewed rape culture on campus. And sexual assault, though we talk about it on campus, is really the crime that we most discuss, even though intimate partner violence is just as prevalent on campus. And so while I was writing the book, I wasn't sure if I should include my own experience with gender-based violence. It was something I didn't really want to talk about. But when I started to think about what campus life is like, I started to think, well, we can't just be talking about sexual assault. And oftentimes, even though there are campaigns on campus, we talk about sexual assault as if most people are sexually assaulted at a party. A lot of times it's somebody we know. And a lot of times sexual assault and intimate partner violence go hand in hand. And so when I was doing my master's at Ryerson University for my master's of journalism, I decided to do my thesis on millennial women's experiences with intimate partner violence. And I had done that because it had been several years since I had been in an abusive relationship, but I still wasn't able to make sense of it and why it happened, and if I was alone. And so I decided to go back to Western and to talk to other students about their experiences with violence. I thought no one was going to talk to me. And so I had planned to spend about 2 days in London looking for students to interview. And I ended up doing about 12 interviews in 2 days. They were about an hour to 2 hours each. And people really wanted to talk. And what I found was that not only were young women experiencing really high levels of intimate partner violence, but a lot of them were people that I knew and I went to school with. And I would see them in class and we would talk and have a conversation and we didn't know what was going on in each other's lives. And it really scared me because a lot of us were in women's studies programs. We were on the front lines. We were organizing Slut Walk. We were doing all these things, but yet it seemed to not connect that what we were experiencing or what we were reading about in theory, what we were advocating for was happening to us. And so as part of my thesis, I spoke to several experts, I spoke to teachers and professors about why this is. And I spoke to one professor in particular who said that she has so many students of hers who will come to class engaged, talking about violence against women, talking about intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and then knock on her door after class and say, my partner did this to me. Is this sexual assault? Is this violence? So there's a big disconnect that I was trying to look for. And so in my book, I talk about sexual violence, but I think what was really shocking to me was just how the ways that young women are dismissed when they experience violence. There seems to be this idea that because it's like a boyfriend-girlfriend experience, that it's not as serious or that you can just leave. And for me, I got a lot of that. And it was not just that I was young, it was that no one around me had really experienced it in my close circle, but also that I was Black and my partner was Southeast Asian. So people would say like, oh, just beat them up, you're Black. Oh, you're scary, you're Black. And there was this association that because I was a Black woman, I was supposed to be the aggressor. And that's something that in doing the research for this book, I found that a lot of times Black women, they're not believed, or they actually go to jail for self-defense in situations of violence because there's this idea that they would be the aggressor. So this section that I'm going to read is a bit shorter. Is about, there's a lot of names in here, so I won't go through them, but if there's any questions about it, I'm happy to discuss it. But I found about 50 young women who were students on campus who were killed by their partners who were also students. And it was just alarming to me how many young women are killed on campus every year, or who are young. Even the ways that young women are kind of erased from the conversation about COVID and the epidemic of violence against women. We don't hear about young women on campus. And so I wrote this chapter kind of to start the conversation. All right, here we go. You need to call the arresting officer immediately and file more charges. The woman on the phone sounded concerned. I had finally found a domestic assault hotline for women of color. The woman I spoke to confirmed the red flags in my relationship with Joshua: stalking, harassment, violence, and sexual assault. The compassion of the stranger validated the severity of my relationship, and I needed it. My friends didn't understand. I had always been functional, even through bouts of anxiety or sadness, but that was working against me now. Everyone around me was desperate to believe that I was not in pieces. They didn't know how to be around me or what to say, especially since they all knew and liked Joshua. I left a voicemail for the officer that day, and he got back to me later in the week. I'd like to file other charges. Look, it doesn't matter whether you file additional charges because the court will see it as a first-time offense and drop it anyways, he said nonchalantly. You could speak to victim services if you need support. There's a deeply held belief that Black women can't be abused and won't tolerate it. Since slavery, Black women have been viewed as strong, animalistic, and unwomanly, unable to fend for themselves, able to fend for themselves, and to withstand physical and mental hardship. The legal system is especially harsh and unsympathetic to Black females victims of intimate partner violence. When a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is needed to prove innocence in a case of self-defense, stereotypes work against Black women. There are few healthcare providers and therapists who specialize in the unique socioeconomic and cultural challenges that Black survivors face, leaving women in the hands of professionals who use a one-size-fits-all model to address Black women's experiences with abuse. And if a Black woman's abuser is a Black man, she is further ostracized by her community for choosing her gender over her race, a traitor, contributing to the mass incarceration of Black men. And if she is trans, she faces the threat of even more violence for speaking up. But it isn't just race that complicates the idea of the perfect victim. It's age and marital status too. Historically, Canada has conducted research and funded programs for domestic violence within heterosexual couples, which involves women who are often legally married or by common law, a group that is typically older. While studies on violence in university-age women were prevalent in the early 90s, research conducted over the past 2 decades has seldom included young unmarried people or the unique factors that affect this: technology, trends in dating, social media, socioeconomic status. Surprisingly, it's not older women who are the most at risk for partner violence in this country. It's young, often university-age women. Stats Canada says that young women between the ages of 20 and 24 have the highest rates of experiencing intimate partner violence, and that we are 6 times more likely to experience partner violence than our male counterparts of the same age. The alarming rate of IPV in millennial women's relationships is shocking, given our generation's action towards social causes. Young women are spearheading discussions on a variety of women's issues. We storm our campuses rallying for sexual assault prevention, and we demand rapists be held accountable. We organize events such as Slut Walk and continue older ones like Take Back the Night. We engage in Twitter campaigns like #IBelieveYou, #MeToo, and #TimesUp to bring attention to violence against women. We write first-person stories about our experiences with sexual assault and misogyny on websites dedicated to centering women's voices. This generation still honors Carol Hanish's statement, "The personal is political," while making every cause more intersectional than the last. We show up for one another. Yet we haven't rallied around partner violence in the same way, despite it being so prevalent among young women. Partner violence in young women's relationships has never been taken seriously because many young adults are still dating. This doesn't carry the same social status as a legally binding commitment of marriage. However, in many ways, millennials face more obstacles to safety than the previous generation. The stigma women experience for casually dating, being non-monogamous or sexually fluid, makes it harder for us to come forward or to know if we even fit into the rigid category of what defines a partner. Unaffordable housing in an unstable market mean young people are moving in together faster than ever and might stay with an abuser because they can't afford to live on their own. Partners can cyberbully us with abusive messages and threats and ruin our lives with intimate photos or defamatory comments that live on the internet forever. Social media lets people share their lives and locations with a tap of an icon, making us more prone to online and physical stalking. And the numbers don't lie. Cyber violence, which includes threats, harassment, and stalking, is more prevalent among women aged 18 to 24. Our bruises are visible, dark, painful reminders that we wear on our bodies, markers of our collective trauma, and they are not healing. But does anyone notice? So, yeah, I think it's a really alarming situation. And it was really shocking to me that all of this, especially that it's happening on campus, that it's not just in Canada that IPV is most prevalent among this age group, it's also in the US. But it's shocking to me that universities are the spaces where they conduct research, but then they do research on often older married cohabitating women, not on the age group that they actually serve. And so in writing this part and using some of my thesis that I wrote in journalism school, it was important to bring this up because the conversation is still very slow moving. And since the book has come out, I've spoken to other universities, we've chatted about it, I've done events on it, and other places are trying to address the issue of sexual violence and intimate partner violence on campus. One of the reasons that they cannot do it is because there is very few, if at all, places where you can go if you're experiencing intimate partner violence. You can go somewhere if you're experiencing sexual violence or you need resources. But right now, the sexual assault centers are understaffed and overworked because they're trying to take into account both crimes and both experiences. And so there's a real backlog and a real kind of starting from scratch in terms of how to address IPV on campus, but it is happening. So to wrap up, those are all really heavy things, and they're heavy, but they're important to note because everyone we know is going through it. We know at least somebody, whether it's a family member or a friend or maybe someone that and maybe hasn't said anything. And so it's really hard to be a young woman on campus and just be a young woman in general and go from childhood to womanhood. But then when you're faced with other experiences, whether you're queer or trans or you're Black, you're from a marginalized group or you're a newcomer, all of these things intersect. But one thing that I found was really important in my time at Western and really made the difference was having friendship and having people who understand what you're going through, having that lived experience. And so in my last year, I actually put on For Colored Girls. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the choreo poem For Colored Girls. It is phenomenal. It's the only book. I cry for everything, but I don't cry with reading books. I cry every time I read this because it's brilliant and it was just what I needed at the time. And while I was in a feminist group called V-Day, which is this violence against women chapter that is at every university that is based on Eve Ensler's work, there was nothing about Black women. And I was in my 4th year and I was getting really tired and disillusioned of just feeling awful. I wasn't leaving the house. I kind of stepped away from going out, even like grocery shopping, even going to class, because I was so tired of having these interactions about race. And I was just really worn down. And all my friends were transferring out and leaving Western. And so part of V-Day, I had put on the vagina monologues twice. And I noticed at the time, of course, there are some issues with Eve Ensler, but one of the things that came up was that there were no Black women in any of the programming we did. And so my last year, I decided to put on For Colored Girls, which was sparked by this class that I took that was called Black Women's History in Canada. And it was through the Women's Studies department. Just about every course where there had like Black or Afro or African in the title at Western got canceled because there was never enough enrollment. And so I signed up and I was really hoping it would happen, and it did. And on that day, I walked into this class and I had never seen so many Black women and women of color in one space. And it was incredible because every week on Wednesdays, we would talk, we would cry. Most of the time we were crying or laughing or sharing experiences. And the space was, yes, a place to learn, but it was mostly to learn from each other and just have somewhere to go at the end of the week. And what I really learned from my time there, and for those who've read the book, it is really dark, but it's also really funny. And humor is what got me through. A lot of laughter, having people to be like, did that just happen? And then laughing about it is kind of it's really an act of resistance, and it's one that a lot of people have used throughout history to get through hard times. And so the last part I want to read to you about is about sisterhood and female friendship and the power of both, but also the power of vulnerability and love. And knowledge exchange is something that comes with that. When you have sisterhood, when you have female friendship, it is an exchange of knowledge, but also throughout the book, I think what is friendship to me and sisterhood to me is all of the Black feminists and scholars that I had encountered during my time at Western that helped me make sense of my experience. So Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, Angela Davis, all of these scholars whose words are littered throughout the book really were the reasons why I was able to make sense of what was happening. They had the theory and I was living it. And so when no one around me was able to understand what I was going through, they were able to do that for me. So this last part is about the class and about the power of sisterhood, and also about the power of anger, because we've seen a lot of anger in the last couple of years. And I think it's really important to talk about who is afforded anger and the anger that we get to see. We've seen how, you know, the Amy Coopers of the world get to use anger and tears. We've seen white men's anger. A great example of that is the Capitol Hill riots, right? That's a type of anger that is incredibly dangerous. It's a type of anger that is responsible for violence and hate crimes and deaths through far-right extremism. If folks don't know, the greatest threat and the greatest amount of mass murders have actually been committed by like far-right extremists since 9/11. So it actually has not been, as Donald Trump had said, newcomers. It's actually been white men. So these are types of angers that are seen as valid because they're patriotic. They protect the nation. But Black women's anger is never seen in the same way. And when you're Black and you express anger, you often put yourself in danger. And so this is about being allowed to be angry and being allowed to be soft through sisterhood and friendship. Okay. There's something life-changing about Black female friendship, especially during a dark time. We know pain, but we also know it won't last forever. We know the transformative power of joy and laughter, the strength of sisterhood, the support of a good or an empathetic head nod. We know that Black female friendship can keep you alive, that sisterhood is essential to survival. But sisterhood isn't just about building an unbreakable support system of boss bitches. It's possibly the only space where Black women are allowed to safely be the opposite. Soft, emotional, vulnerable. It's also a space to celebrate our successes and our triumphs, and to admit that the burden of acting the part of the unbreakable Black woman is crushing us. Black girl magic is a term that was popularized in 2013 by Keshawn Thompson to celebrate all the dopeness, beauty, and strength that encompasses Black women and Black womanhood. Yet however glorious Black girl magic may be, it can trap us, once again labeling Black women as superhuman and impervious to pain. Black girl magic should be all about celebrating our resilience, but also about admitting when things aren't right. Sisterhood gives us a place to talk about both. We also need sisterhood because our collective reality is, at times, grim. Some research shows that Black women are the most likely group to be unarmed when killed by police. We are more likely than white women to experience sexual assault and intimate partner violence. Black trans women face disproportionate rates of violence and homicide. Black mothers are 3 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. While Black women are leading or founding social justice movements around the world, from Me Too to Black Lives Matter, that also uplift white women and Black men, Black women rarely get the same support for our causes in return. This is why sisterhood is essential for Black women's survival. Irrespective of physical or digital space, it's a place for Black women, for once, to be for and about ourselves. Others depend on our anger to move their causes forward. Yet when we are angry for ourselves, our anger is unjustified. So often, Black women's anger is weaponized against us. From TV and film tropes to politics, the legacy of the anti-Black woman has trivialized Black women's rage, painting our expressions of pain as aggressive, hostile, and unwomanly, or worse, as comic relief. While being an angry or emotional woman is trivialized as hysteria, for Black women, it's dangerous. Black women have to hold it together for ourselves and for everyone else. an expectation based on the historic misconception that we can handle taxing physical and emotional labor. Yet if the weight becomes too much, if we try to seek out emotional support like therapy, we're weak. If we talk about it publicly, we're entitled. Unlike our white female counterparts, being righteously angry can cost us our jobs and our relationships and possibly our lives. And unlike white women, our tears get us nowhere. Despite systemic and institutional oppression and discrimination, Black women are never allowed the chance to feel anger, even when it stems from pain and sadness, even when working through it can be transformative and healing. The past few years have been marked by women's rage, stemming from the Me Too movement, which was started by Tarana Burke, a Black civil rights activist who used the term almost a decade before actor Alyssa Milano. Women are standing up against a patriarchal system that reinforces that women are inferior, deserving of being violated, left out, paid less, and pushed out. But who is afforded rage? Who are the voices on the front lines who are praised and uplifted? And whose voices are still on the margins, scolded and shamed for also wanting their moment to be angry? Black women's expressions of rage have been stifled for more than a century. From the first wave of feminism that cast aside the work of Black women for a mainstream white women's campaign. They secured property and voting rights for themselves while Black women were banned from demonstrations or forced to walk behind white women. Even today, Black women who speak up to share their Me Too stories have been met with silence and skepticism from survivors. Stories about police violence and anti-Black racism against female-identified people don't get the same kind of virality or outrage as their male counterparts, sparking the hashtag #SayHerName. We use our rage to push forward our causes and the causes of everyone else, uplifting other women, standing up for the rights of men, but in return, who's angry for us? Society calls Black women bitter for expressing rage over social, political, economic, reproductive, and gender discrimination, but celebrates white women's rage as iconic and inspiring. Where white men are entitled to their rage, which is still considered non-threatening, even as it has caused some of the worst tragedies in North America in the past few years, Black women are punished for thinking they have a right to this rage. So we internalize it, leaving that rage with nowhere to go but darting around inside us until our health and well-being are destroyed in the chaos. Internalizing rage can be detrimental, but vocalizing it can be transformative. Women's collective rage is both a healing and political tool, and it's one that brought attention to the actions of powerful men like Brett Kavanaugh, Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and Jeffrey Epstein. It's birthed new movements and protests, BLM, the Women's March, Slut Walk. For Black women, coming together with other Black women and voicing that rage can change the world. So I'll stop there, but the end part of that goes into Brittany C. Cooper. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her work. She wrote this really great book called Eloquent Rage, and it's about Black women's anger and how it can be used as a transformative tool. And so I talk a little bit about that and how it's really our superpower. So yes, we're seen as angry, but we can turn that around and use it as a superpower that can change the world. And coinciding with that, I also talk about Audre Lorde, who I adore. And Audre Lorde gave a talk called The Uses of Anger. And in The Uses of Anger, she talks about how women of color's collective anger, this kind of symphony of anger and emotion, can be so transformative and healing, and it can ultimately change the world and birth these movements that we've seen over time and that we're seeing today. Because the anger that we have is not the same type of anger that we are seeing in the Capitol Hill riots. That's hatred. That's hatred that's directed at other people. Women of color's anger, it stems from grief, from being in a world that you are constantly kind of these things are being thrown at you and you can't do anything about it, of complacency, of being passive, and really of grieving. And so when we come together, we offer each other the chance to heal and change the world through what we do next with it. And so for me, learning that and having that space of sisterhood, and not just Black female friendship, any type of friendship, laughter, joy, a brighter outlook was able to change things for me, and allowed me to make peace with what was happening, but also know that I wasn't alone. And so that's kind of where I end the book. That was the last chapter. And we put on the show, we put on For Colored Girls, and it was really emotional. We had 2 nights. I don't know if anyone has read it here. It is so hard to read. It's really hard to get through. There are no page breaks. And so we fumbled the first performance. We fumbled. It was terrible. We're like, you know what? We're not going to do this. There were like 14 people in the audience. It was really bad. And we were so disheartened because we had spent months rehearsing. And our last night, we're like, you know what? Maybe we should cancel it, but we'll go on because we've done all this work. And there was like a little curtain, and I looked through the curtain, and there must have been over 100 Black women. I've never seen so many Black people in London in one spot, and they weren't just students. They were like older women, professors, like women just kind of in their 80s and 90s who had all come to see the show and see us. And it was a really nice moment. And towards the end, as we were finishing up, one of the women who was in the play was crying, and everybody was crying. It was really nice. It was like, it always gives me goosebumps when I think about it. But that's exactly what sisterhood is, and knowledge exchange is, and showing up for one another. And so to have that many people in one room who get it, in a city like that where you're not even seen, and where you've been through all of this stuff, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, all of us have been through it, was really kind of, I think I will never forget that moment. It was one of the most magical moments of my life. And so in some ways, I hope that the book, though dark, is that for some people, right? It's that moment of just kind of aha, but also knowing that you're not alone. And so I'm going to wrap up there, and I want to thank you for sticking with me through the reading and the talk, and we'll get on to questions.
Thank you, Eternity. Your story, I'm from Southwestern Ontario. I don't live in London, but it's one of my closest big cities, and wow, just I don't know what to say. I support you, and I support your book. It's a wonderful book, and I'm glad that you are sharing this story. I think it's really important for people to know what you've experienced and what people are experiencing now, and how to help. We have a few questions that came through. If someone wants to add any additional questions through the chat, I do have a question that came through the chat, and then we have some that came through email as well. So I'll go through those with you. First of all, Elodie commented, great book I'm reading, and I'm recommending it to friends. Not sure if you'll touch on this in your book. You discuss your grandmother's love for cooking, feeding people, etc., and as a result, the impact it had on you and your weight. Mm-hmm. How and what did you do to overcome this, and what advice would you give to Black girls growing up in such similar situation?
Yes. Well, I'm really glad someone touched on my grandmother. I've actually since then got her tattooed on my arm. So in the book I talk about being really overweight as a child, and growing up, like being a child during like the rise of the childhood obesity epidemic with sugary snacks. And so for me, I never even today, I never saw it as like, oh gosh, she fed me. I think for a lot of people, and so my grandmother was Anglo-Indian, but for a lot of cultures, food is love. Like you feed because you love somebody. And she loved me a lot, and she just fed me, and she gave me whatever she wanted, and we lived next to a McDonald's, and so I was always eating. And I think I was lucky that, nobody made a comment. Nobody ever made a comment about my weight. But as a result, I've noticed that I struggle. I have a terrible relationship with food. Most people that I know in my family have a terrible relationship with food. And it also stems from like two things. Like for my grandfather, he grew up extremely poor, not having food. So, he'll never waste food. And for me, I'm not like that. So if I don't like something, I'm going to throw it out. And there's, it's always a conflict. So I was pretty overweight until about 13 or 14 years old, and I had to learn how to cook for myself. And I think at the time I had learned it from Jessica Alba, because Jessica Alba had grown up the same way in a family that cooked a lot of food, and she was overweight. And I had to learn how to start cooking for myself, which is also tough, because when you come from a family where, you have like a matriarch who is always cooking, when you start to like buy vegetables and, run on the treadmill, they think something's wrong with you or they're offended. So I just started to get my own stuff and start to cook, and it's still a problem. you know, my mom doesn't understand really what I'm eating and she kind of makes fun of me, but it's also for my mental health as well, that I am in control of what I'm eating. So the advice I have for Black girls, for really anybody, is I've noticed it's also a cultural thing to comment on people's weight. So you haven't seen, like, you know, your cousin or your daughter or whatever in months, and you're like, oh, you've gained weight, and it's supposed to be this affectionate thing. And I know a lot of Caribbean people do it. But it's not okay. And so I think that if we can normalize not internalizing people's comments about our weight and just cutting it off, just saying, you know what, like, we're not going to talk about my weight. I'm happy at my weight, or I'm okay with where I am. I think that's the only thing I can offer aside from starting to cook your own food and put up those boundaries, because food is a boundary regardless. And so I would say that, because in the last like 3 months, I've had so many friends just call me and be like, I just saw my family on Zoom after like own food, cook your own food, and know that you are okay, that you're perfect the way that you are, and you can set that boundary.
Thank you. Okay. What has this experience been like for you for a book that's been so well received and has recognition among countless bestsellers? What's it been like to celebrate and enjoy this during COVID?
Yeah, it's it's been it's okay. I'm not going to say it's been like the best thing, but I actually think it was better than I thought it was going to be. So my book came out on March 31st, and my book launch was March 30th. And my book was in transit at stores on March 13th when everything closed. So my book was like, even if you wanted to open, it was just stuck in this, it was like basically locked in boxes in stores. And I felt like it was honestly the end of the world. And I think for anyone who writes, like, I wrote this book for 10 years every day, and I wrote every day especially for the last couple of years. And I thought about my book, like my book launch, I had just bought like $500 worth of clothes and shoes because I had anticipated traveling, and none of it happened. So what I learned to do very quickly was kind of turn it around. And I think a lot of authors and a lot of publishers had never been in the situation where things were virtual. Like, we're very much book people, like tangible things, and we all had to learn how to adapt. And so I started doing Instagram lives. I was talking with my publisher about like how we can do things right after it's released, how I can collaborate. We did like Twitter threads and stuff. So books that inspired me. And I really quickly learned that this is almost a better way of doing things and celebrating, because you get to celebrate with way more people. So if somebody had, to pick up their kids from school, or you just couldn't make it, now you can be on your computer or you can watch it later. So even like this is recorded, you can watch it later. You meet people from all around the world, which is really exciting, and you get to engage with more people. Whereas an event, you're signing books for an hour, there's a lineup, you don't get to see, you don't get to talk to everybody. You can do things differently. So I've been celebrating by basically just connecting with people in so many different ways. I use Twitter a whole lot now. I talk to people send me messages on Instagram and on Twitter and Facebook. And it's nice to like communicate with people in that way. So to celebrate, I just eat a lot of cake. But then, I tell people I'm eating cake and we all celebrate. So it's nice in that way that I get to connect with way more people.
Okay. What is the number one thing you think any organization can do right now to support people of color, and in particular, women of color?
I think the first thing is to actually commit to it. And I'm thinking of like performative allyship and optical allyship. There have been so many commitments to doing better in the wake of last summer and George Floyd and the renewed racial reckoning. And it's great and all, but why weren't you doing it before? And so I think a lot of companies, a lot of workplaces, they're being reactive. They're not being proactive. So every time something happens or someone dies or is murdered in the Black community, then all of a sudden there's there's support or there's rallying around that, and we don't need that. We need it. We need it now. We need it to be consistent. And so, I think one thing that is really important that we can do is check in with people and ask people how they're feeling. I think a lot of times, just because it's not us in that situation, people think that it's not affecting us. And there's actually this term, I think it's called linked fate, where a lot of Black people are getting PTSD from seeing like viral videos of Black death, but they're also associating themselves with it. So if they see somebody who's been killed by police, or we're talking about it, they see their son, their brother, their mother, or themselves in it, and it becomes hard. It becomes almost this idea that like it's going to happen to you or someone you know at some point. That's really heavy to carry. So if employers, for example, could say, you know what, it's been rough, I understand what's happening, if you need some time, or you want to take an extra lunch, or you want to take a couple of days off, I think that makes all the difference. It's so hard to just work period, because we're all overworked, but also during COVID, we're having burnout, and then being burned out by what's happening and possibly suffering from PTSD. So those are great ways of actually committing, being open and transparent about any initiatives that are happening. I had a friend who asked for, in wake of the summer, asked for a book club and could not get a book club. These may not be important things to those who don't have this experience, but even just knowing that you have the support of these little things, they don't cost anything, they don't, they don't change the workplace culture, they're important. And I think just letting women of color and people of color just have their support. I give talks to companies, and one of the issues that came up was that somebody had complained that like, oh, the Black people hang out together, or, oh, they have like their own chat group. Let people have their chat group. It's hard, right? Like it's hard being a person of color at this time. So let people have their things. We don't need to be monitoring and policing. So I think that's important. And then lastly, training is great. I give training sessions, but it's not like a one and done. Everyone should be informed. The company or wherever you're working, even if you're a student, there should be things that you can attend, that you can be part of. It shouldn't just be like, HR deciding. Everyone should be informed. There should be more than one. There should be more than three. It should be a thing that continues on, so that we know that you're serious about it. And there also needs to just be support in numbers. It is scary to go talk to somebody and say like, this is happening in the world, I need a break, or I don't like how this is happening, or I don't like what that person said, because you fear losing your job. And so there needs to be some sort of intervention or some sort of outside help. There are a ton of diversity educators and trainers who can come in and work in teams. So there's just a couple. I have a lot, but there's just a few.
Okay, thank you. Karen, you have your hand up. Did you want to actually ask a question? Or are you just agreeing?
Yeah, no, I had a question.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I have your book. I had ordered it before the lockdown, so it actually got delivered, shortly after,
great.
back last spring. Anyway, my question is whether, well, I should say I'm a professor at Western. So I'm, and also an alumna. So I'm interested for various reasons here. But my question is whether, and I know obviously your book is focused on Black women's experience, but I'm just wondering if you talk to other friends or students, Black men, to see what kind of experiences they had in terms of exclusion and other kind of negative stereotypes and things to do with violence and sexuality, about the social images about Black men too, and how those kind of interact with what you're describing of your own experience.
Yes, absolutely. I think what is interesting, I was very worried that the book wouldn't be well received, because it's it's talking about me, but I think there's something in it for every person who's gone to university or just wants to fit in. And so my agent, for example, she's not a Black woman, but she's an Indigenous woman, and she actually went to Western too. And a lot of the reason she left was just for being a woman. And I've spoken to just women who've left the school because of the culture of like the pro-rape chants that happen every frosh week, and just the culture of misogyny. And so I've noticed that definitely, like, just the environment of misogyny and rape culture, there have been a lot of women who felt very uncomfortable and just left, regardless of race. In terms of gender and sexual orientation, a lot of my friends refused to go out because they would be harassed. Like my gay and queer friends would not go out. They had been assaulted by bouncers and assaulted by other people in bars. So a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia. And then for Black men, one of my closest friends, who I talk about in the book, Malcolm, he ended up transferring out and going to the Caribbean to finish his degree. But he was, I think for Black men, there's like an added layer of being feared by everyone. And so I felt that, but I think when people don't know haven't seen you, and they've seen you in movies and in, you know, like in TV and film, there's this idea that Black men are really dangerous and, you know, and violent and robbers. And so I didn't meet a whole lot of Black men there actually, but those that I did know and those that I've met along the way, there's always this fear that like they're up to no good. They're, you know, they're going to rob, or they're going to hurt someone, or they're violent. There's not a good intention behind why they're there. And a lot of the situations that we've seen across campuses in North America, so like Simon Fraser University, I don't know if anyone has seen that, a Black alumnus was pepper sprayed and tasered and then arrested for like resisting an officer after the school had multiple de-escalation processes. The amount of times I have seen Black men being kicked off campus, or the police being called for like studying in the library or getting a snack, I think that's indicating that just their presence alone is making people frightened. And it may not be, I think sometimes you may not know someone, but like the fear is there because maybe you've grown up, right? Like internalizing this, or someone you grew up with socialized you to believe these things. And so the fear is so deep that you would call the police. And so I think that really was a big issue. I had a Black professor, a male professor, and he would always say, like, you know, on top of just being a man, I'm a Black man, and he would never leave his office door closed. He would keep it open. And so that's something that he would use. So it's really unfortunate. It's also really scary because you're not just dealing with it on campus, but you're also dealing with it outside of the city. And London had a, well, I don't know about right now, but had a really high stop and frisk, I guess, had high stop and frisk numbers. So yeah, it's tough for everyone, and it also contributes to the dropout rates. It when you feel like that, you don't feel like you belong, or you just don't see anyone who looks like you. And a lot of times people think you're dumb, right? Like they think we're going to sit in the back of the classroom, where they think that you're incapable of contributing to a group project. You drop out or you leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me unmute myself, sorry. The next question. What coping mechanisms did you apply to survive and thrive during this period? Because obviously you stuck it out. You told us this story of at second year, and then you're telling us stories of fourth year, so you stayed. Mm-hmm. I know you spoke about your group that you started.
Yes. So my editor asked me that while writing the book. She's like, I think you need to explain to people why you stayed. And I'm like, do I? And then I'm like, actually I do, because who notes that something is so terrible and decides to stay there? And I often thought about leaving, but to me, I thought, what is I know this type of danger and I know this type of environment. Who's to say that I choose another school and it's not worse? Like this is a situation I'm comfortable with, despite being so uncomfortable. And so I made the decision to stay. And when I made that decision, I said, okay, well, you have to find ways of dealing with it. So for me, I think I quickly learned that I couldn't take things so seriously. Excuse me. So I had to learn how to laugh at myself and laugh at what was happening. So when somebody said something like, oh, your English is so good, instead of getting angry about it, I had to kind of laugh it off. And I had to recognize that none of these things are personal attacks. Even when they feel like they are, this is somebody who is ignorant enough to think it, but also say it and believe it. This is not about me. Changing that mindset made a huge difference for me. And so did having a support system. So I had, by my third year, I was no longer friends with my best friend, and my friend Malcolm had moved away. So I had to find new friends, and part of the way that I found new friends was through this violence against women's group, this like feminist group, and having that was so important. Like there were so many days when I did not want to go anywhere because I was so depressed, and so knowing that there was somebody who could get me out of the house, or I could call, or I could talk to, even though some of my friends had not gone to that school. I had friends back in Toronto, calling them, inviting them up for the weekend, or going back home some weekends was really important. Having a support system. And I'm thinking of moving out of Toronto now, and I always think about my time in London. What got me through it was having people. So having a support system is so important, and that's what got me through. And so did laughing and having people you can laugh with, and people who get things. And so when I was putting on the For Colored Girls play, and even being in class in that Black Women's History in Canada course, all we did was talk, because we hadn't talked for so long with other people who look like us. So having that and laughing and being there for one another, we didn't get any work done in class, and we didn't get a whole lot of rehearsing done during the play, because there was just so much to talk about. So that is so important. What else got me through? I think taking on the term Black was very important to me. So when I resisted, I didn't get anywhere. And I quickly learned that in London, you are Black, you are white, you're Asian, you're brown. There's no in between. So I would start to kind of be like, actually, like, I'm multiracial, my mom is this, and nobody cares. And so I quickly learned that you have to choose, because there's not only a target on your back, but it becomes a way of surviving, and that's how you fit into other groups. So to cope, I actually turned into being politically Black, getting involved in Black issues, reading up on Black scholars, informing myself about a part of myself that I didn't know. And Tessa McWatt, who wrote Shame on Me, it's such an amazing book. She talks about being politically Black. She's very mixed. She's from all different types of backgrounds, but she talks about being at a Black Lives Matter rally and not feeling Black enough until somebody says, you can come to the front. And it was a moment she was politically Black, and she realized that being Black stood for something important in her life. And so being politically Black, and not just being allowed to be called Black, but using that as a method of survival and being proud about it, made such a difference.
Thank you. We have one last question. It's more related to writing this book. So this person is writing a book, and they are eager for best practices or tips that you have.
Okay. It's not fun. It's best practices. I think you need to know why you're writing a book. You need to know why. If it's to get back at somebody, not a good idea. If it's because you're bored, if you want it published, not a good idea. Every story, I think we all have stories, but that story has to be universal in a sense. It has to be something that people relate to, but it also has to be something that like you can commit to. Even when it gets tough, if you are like, I still want to tell this story, even if people don't get it, or even if I'm tired of writing it, but you still want to, you need to be able to do it in the long term. So that's one thing. I would say, I know people hate this advice, and I hated it at one point too, but if there's the type of kind of genre or author that you love, read and consume those books. You're going to become a better kind of, you're gonna be able to hone in those skills and what you want by reading similar books. So even though they may be competition, your competition is actually a blessing in disguise, because if you decide to go with a publisher, they're going to ask you who's your competition. And if those are books that have done well, even though they're kind of in competition with you, that's a good thing. And one thing I've learned along the process is yes, your book is about, the craft, but a lot of times, especially if you're trying to publish a book, it's always about the market and what market gap you are filling. And it's a tough pill to swallow when you're an artist. But, for me, it was that there was no book in Canada about this. There's no book from this perspective, and that was a gap in itself, and I wanted to fill it. But even then, people still didn't understand it. So I had to know and stand firm in what the book was about, what I believed it to be about. Other things is, if you can write every day. It doesn't have to be like a page. Write a sentence. Keep notebooks so you can write things down or on your phone. If you are a paper person, there's nothing wrong with writing your drafts on paper. I wrote most of my drafts on paper and then typed them up. Other best practices. Make writing a part of your routine, and defend your writing time. People sometimes don't understand when you're writing a book. I still don't think like my mom understands what writing a book is. Gonna be like, I have to write, and she'd be talking, and when you work, you don't get right back to writing. So defend your time, have a routine, light a candle, make it your time, make it your space. Even if you write a word, that is okay. And then last thing is, on top of consuming other material, I'm a strong believer in inspiration and doing whatever it takes for inspiration. So I would go to events, I would go to festivals, I would consume anything and go anywhere, because all of those things ended up inspiring me, especially when I was stuck. And like, there have been times when things may not seem, you know, part of my book was about mental health. So I would go to like mental health conferences or talks just to hear and think about things. And those really inspired me too. So all those things, and have faith that your book will get you where you need to be. I wrote for 8 years without like knowing if it was going to get published. I just knew that I had this and it was important to me. So yes.
Thank you. Okay, Eternity, that's it for the questions. First of all, I just want to thank you for sharing your story, sharing your vulnerability in what you experienced. And I do encourage everyone to go out and buy Eternity's book, and also look back on this recording. She mentioned a lot of other great artists and authors, and I think it's worth exploring that. I think it's really important that everyone try to educate themselves and make it a better place, make it a better place for everybody, for equality. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
I'm just going to end our presentation today with some slides from WXN for upcoming events. Please stick around to watch those. And again, Eternity, thank you. And we'll be sending out the recording to everyone today. So thank you everyone who participated.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so like I said, Eternity's book, they said this would be fun, is on sale. You can get it at Chapters Indigo or any other place where they sell books, and then just do a search for Eternity Martis and you will find it. We have more upcoming free virtual book club events. In June, we actually have a French event with one of our top 100 winners, Danielle Henkel. So that's available. As well, Christine Daganaz will be joining us in July for her book, The Intentional MBA. And coming up in the fall, we have 2 more authors lined up, Cynthia Loist with Find Your Pleasure and Amanda Hamilton, Not That Likeable at First. We have some upcoming Monday Mojo events. Our last one with Nkechi and Claudette is happening on May 31st. So that's next Monday, and it's almost sold out. If you're still interested in joining us, be sure to grab your tickets soon. And then in June, we will have Leanne and Sin Cherry joining us for 4 sessions in June. And it's just a kind of intimate event that we have every month with 2 top 100 winners. We are right now in the middle of our Stand in Raw Courage event series. And on May 20th, we will be joined by 4 women who are WXN members who will be sharing their stories of raw courage. And we look forward to having you join us. We have another 2 sessions as well in June, and then the part 3 and part 4 will continue into September. And we are releasing our annual report card this week, and we'll be having our Canadian Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Summit next week. We are being joined by dozens of experts in EDI, and it's going to be a very informative summit, and we do encourage you to attend. For membership, we encourage you to join membership with WXN for just $99 for an annual membership. You'll receive discounts to events, access to information that falls outside of our regular communications, and lots of other perks, and a network of 1,000 women. Our top 100 nominations are still open. They are open until the end of June. So if you know a top 100, or if you know a powerful woman in Canada that you believe deserves to be recognized, please nominate her. You can visit our website and search Top 100 Awards. And thank you to our corporate partners. Without their partnership, we wouldn't be able to put on free events like this one, as well as the support from our authors. And that's everything. Thank you so much to everyone for attending our webinar, and feel free to share your message of standing in raw courage.